I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the front lines, the latest news from the diplomatic scene, and we speak to the Kyiv Independent's business editor, Liliane Bivings, about Ukraine's economic climate and the numerous pressures on businesses across the country.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 30th of July, 2 years and 162 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and the Kyiv Independent's business editor, Liliane Bivings. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has visited the front lines in Kharkiv Oblast. Reuters reported that Zelensky travelled to Vovchansk in the northeastern Kharkiv region near the Russian border, where Moscow's forces have been trying to break through. In released footage, Zelensky was shown presenting state awards to soldiers and shaking their hands. In video clips posted online, he later said authorities had already begun strengthening air defence systems in the region, where Russian air attacks have decreased in recent weeks. Speaking in Poltava to the west of Kharkiv, Zelensky told a group of entrepreneurs, "In terms of security," I'm quoting from Zelensky here, "and without going into too many details, we have already begun strengthening the airspace around Kharkiv." Just to give some more context on the area, the Ukrainian General Staff said Russian forces do continue to conduct airstrikes in the border areas, and that in the last 24 hours, Kyiv's forces had repelled 6 assaults near Vovchansk and the village of Hryboke, more than 19 miles to the west. Let's remember that Russia's attacks in Donetsk is Moscow's main offensive thrust. The assault in the Kharkiv region has stretched Kyiv's armies, forcing them to commit and maintain valuable reinforcements. Some more details on Russia's advance in the east in Donbass. Serhiy Dobryak, head of Pokrovsk city's military administration, told the US broadcaster Radio Free Europe, quote, "As of today, the city is 20 kilometers, that's 12 miles, from the front line." Dobryak said many of Pokrovsk's residents were reluctantly deciding to evacuate. He said that the current population was 60,000 people, including 4,000 children. Reuters writes that to the northeast of Pokrovsk, Russian troops have advanced closer to the strategic road linking Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Remember, on Saturday, Moscow claimed control of the village of Lozovatske, which lies about 6 kilometers from the town. Ukraine did not comment on this claim. To the south, this is from the Kyiv Independent, a spokesperson for the Tavria group of forces speaking on national TV said that Russia had attempted assaults from 2 different fronts in the direction of Hulai-Pole in Zaporizhia Oblast after a, quote, long pause. His quote continues, "Some reports said it could be a major offensive with the formation of an offensive group, but according to our intelligence, it is a continuation of the tactics of small assault actions, because the total number of the Russian group in Zaporizhia Oblast has not changed in terms of the total number of troops." The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said Russian forces continue to attack Ukrainian troops from positions in the Orikhiv and Hulayapol directions in Zaporizhia Oblast. Bringing this all together then, in the UK's Defence Intelligence Daily Update, they write, in July 2024, this is a bit more of a broad assessment of where we are. In July 2024, Russian ground forces maintained continuous attacks in central Donetsk Oblast. The Russian ground forces made steady advances westwards, taking control of several villages and moving closer to the logistics hub of Pokrovsk. The Russian ground forces also made advances northwards into the town of New York, which has been on the front line since 2014. The town is almost certainly contested between Russian troops and the Ukrainian armed forces. They conclude it is likely that Russia will continue to make tactical advances in the coming weeks. However, its overall operational capability remains limited by several factors, including a high attrition rate, limited training, and a shortage of officers. Moving away from the front lines, across Ukraine, Russian attacks across the country have killed at least 4 people and injured at least 14 over the past day. In Donetsk, an attack on Toretsk killed 3 civilians and injured 3 others. 1 more person was killed in Hrodivka, and 2 were injured in Donetsk region. This all comes from the governor, Vadim Filashkin. In Kharkiv Oblast, a 71-year-old man was injured during a Russian attack against the town of Kupiansk, and Russian attacks against Kherson Oblast injured 8 people and damaged critical infrastructure and port facilities. Next, The Guardian have written up the claims from Ukraine's military intelligence agency that it was involved in an ambush that killed fighters from Russia's Wagner group in the West African nation of Mali. Spokesman for Ukraine's GUR military intelligence agency, Andrei Yusov, said that, quote, "The rebels received necessary information, and not just information, which enabled a successful military operation against Russian war criminals." On more context and information, Yusov said the agency, quote, "won't discuss the details at the moment, but there will be more to come." Finally, from me, the Associated Press are reporting a new package of military aid to Ukraine from the US. It's worth $1.7 billion, officials announced on Monday, and includes an array of munitions for air defense systems, artillery, mortars, and anti-tank and anti-ship missiles. The package includes $1.5 billion in funding for long-term contracts through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative and $200 million in immediate military aid taken from Pentagon stockpiles. The Pentagon said that longer-term contracted weapons will include, quote, capabilities to augment, end quote, Ukraine's air defences, including short and medium-range munitions. The Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative will also provide funding for mortar rounds, anti-armour systems, electronic warfare equipment, explosives, secure communication systems, and commercial satellite imagery services. The weapons and equipment provided through the USAI will go through the contracting process and so won't get to the warfront for months or even years. And with this announcement, the US has now sent more than $55.4 billion in security aid to Ukraine since February 2022. Those are the updates from the front lines. Francis, what has taken your eye in the military and political developments today?
Thanks, David. I'm going to start today by shifting our attention to Europe's Russian allies, as there have been some notable developments from them. You'll recall that Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico has been out of action for several months after that assassination attempt. He's back, and he said yesterday that he would halt diesel supplies to Ukraine if Kyiv fails to restore oil flows from Russia through its territory. Now, for a little bit more context here, because I know it sounds like a bit of an obscure choice to start, but it is very interesting and revealing as to the way things are going in that part of Europe at the moment. So both Slovakia and, surprise, Hungary have been stepping up pressure since Kyiv put Lukoil on sanctions last month, which stops the company's oil from passing through Slovak and Hungarian refineries. Now, Slovak deliveries account for 1/10 of Ukraine's diesel consumption, Fico said, adding that he's proposing a technical solution to restore the stopping oil flows to the Prime Minister of Ukraine on Friday, but without there being major movement on it. Fundamentally, this dispute has shown how much some EU countries still depend on Russian energy more than 2 years after the bloc decided to stop oil imports from Moscow following the full-scale invasion. Hungary, Slovakia and Czechia have exemptions to that ban on Russia pipeline oil imports to give them time to find alternatives. But as listeners will know, Ukraine has been ramping up its sanctions on more and more entities, Russian particularly, but also those who are affiliated with Russia. And this is an example of one of those which is upsetting, particularly the Slovakians and the Hungarians, because it has an impact on their ability to acquire this energy and indeed profit margins. Now, we know Viktor Orban's public stance on almost everything. He's never shy to say it. And his latest rant on Saturday was quite something. He said on a trip to Romania that the EU was sliding towards oblivion and warned of a new Asia-orientated world order whilst putting his support behind Donald Trump's US presidential bid. He said, and I quote, "Europe has given up defending its own interests. All Europe is doing today is following the US's pro-democrat foreign policy unconditionally, even at the cost of its self-destruction. A change is coming that has not been seen for 500 years. What we are facing is, in fact, a world order change." And he went on, citing that China, India, Pakistan and Indonesia are becoming the dominant centre of the world. Now, nothing especially shocking there. But what is interesting, given the story I've just touched on from Slovakia and indeed reports in the Kyiv Independent and others, is that Hungary is also, further to its protestations around the situation on Russian oil and gas, is subtly relaxing its entry requirements for Russian and Belarusian citizens. So they are now included in its national card program, which allows for these citizens to work in Hungary for up to 2 years. Now, the concern here is that there's no special vetting process at the European level for national card holders. So that means that as of this month, when the national card became available for citizens of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Bosnia-Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia, many thousands of people could be permitted into an EU country, Hungary, without adequate checks, particularly security checks. That comes at the same time, of course, as we've had numerous leaders in Europe and indeed intelligence chiefs in Britain and elsewhere talking about how Russia is actively seeking to undermine Europe through hybrid attacks. That is not a hypothetical. That is something that we know is happening, and there have been numerous examples of it. Of course, there was numerous speculation at the end of last week with the beginning of the Olympic Games that Russia might be implicated in particular narratives being spread around before that, and indeed perhaps behind the disruption on the rail network. That has not been definitively proven, as we said at the time, but there was particular fingers being pointed in Moscow's direction, shall we say. So obviously you can understand why there is frustration and concern here from European leaders, because essentially what they are arguing is that Hungary is opening the door to Russians to enter the EU without adequate security checks. Then, of course, with the Schengen arrangement, they're able to travel all the way through Hungary, all the way through the rest of the European Union, in theory, and do whatever they like, again, without being able to be stopped because there aren't border checks. So this is the situation, and you can imagine that there are all sorts of conversations taking place behind closed doors within the European Union and indeed among ambassadors to Hungary saying, look, this is something that we are not happy and comfortable with. But, of course, Hungary is very much on the proverbial warpath at the moment, given that it has the EU presidency and it is essentially being blocked from wielding much power in it doing that because Josip Borrell and others are hosting alternative summits than those that Hungary is organising in an attempt to basically signal to Russia and others that Hungary may well be figurehead for the EU at the moment as part of its rotation, but the reality is that the EU does not recognise Hungary in its current role, particularly because of its stance on Ukraine. So a complicated picture, David, but really important to contextualise this given the situation at the moment, and I think we can expect this story to rumble. We have had considerable concern now for many weeks and months that Putin is generally trying to use migration as a weapon to destabilise the bloc. This would speak to that, potentially, albeit more overtly than some of the other migrants that have been, as it were, transferred to try and enter Finland and other countries, as I say, as part of a disruptive weapon. So an interesting story and one that we will continue to monitor. Turning to Ukraine next, though, Kyiv's finance minister Sergei Marchenko, in an interview with RBC-Ukraine, has stated that Kyiv, along with the IMF, estimates an additional financial need of $12 to $15 billion from partners for 2025 due to the continuation of the war into the next year. He reminded that while preparing the current programme with the IMF, one of the key parameters was that the active phase of the war would last until mid-2024. But that forecast has not materialised, far from it. So he says, now we are constantly discussing with our partners that we need additional financial assurance because the war will continue into 2025. And we need to have a buffer. At the same time, he goes on, in his opinion, by raising taxes, Ukraine also needs to signal to its partners and silence critics who say that Ukraine's own contribution is insufficient. We are showing by raising taxes that we are ready for the most difficult decisions and that we are making our own contribution. So I mention this here because, of course, it speaks particularly to the financial situations, acute financial problems that Kyiv is contending with at the moment as the war has been extended. I know that Liliane will have lots more thoughts of this, I'm sure. But more broadly, I think it bears repeating here that in the context of wider strategic discussions at the moment, you still hear the refrain from Western leaders, we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But time costs money as well as lives, and almost certainly far more of both than necessary are being lost because of the failures of the West to adopt a more robust, assertive approach. Wars are, as I say, inconceivably expensive enterprises, especially the longer that they last. And I think it may sound obvious, but worth repeating, that when we hear leaders raising concerns about the cost of the war on their own economies, the fact is this war is being enabled to be continued by the policies that have been adopted by the West. I think when the history books are written, particularly of the first year of the war, many people will say that if the West had chosen to be as assertive as it has been now in terms of weapons that have been granted, etc., that the war may well have been able to have been won, or at the very least far more contained than it has been. But the fact is that drip approach, whilst may be essential, again, another one for us to debate, may well have been the only possible path in terms of where the West was in the weapons it had available, also in terms of the concerns about understanding the Russian position on nuclear escalation, etc., etc. The fact is that it has come at a price, and that price is financial, and that price is in human lives, and all of the other things that we talk about all of the time on the podcast. That's where we are, David. Two complicated areas there, and I hope listeners will forgive me for extending a little bit of time on them, but they're really relevant, of course, to lots of different conversations at the moment. And as I say, I imagine that we will be returning to them again very soon.
Thank you very much, Francis. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast the Kyiv Independent's business editor, Liliane Bivings. Liliane, thank you so much for joining us. It wasn't through design, actually, that Francis spoke so much about the economic and business updates there, but it's fantastic to have you here to add your thoughts. Is there anything you'd like to add or contextualise or speak about from what Francis mentioned, particularly about the Marchenko interview? I think was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm glad to be back. This is something that has been talked about in Kyiv and in Ukraine a lot. The fact that the war is going to continue to go on, that it's going to continue to require foreign external financing. But my mind is really on this other part of Marchenko's statements today that were also in RBC-Ukraine about the government's plan to increase taxes as a way of also financing its defense needs. So while it needs $12 to $15 billion for next year in external financing, the government is trying to fill this about $12 billion hole for the rest of the year that it has in its budget. And one of the ways that it's trying to do that is through increasing taxes on individuals, companies, and through excise taxes. And that's created quite the controversy here in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Maybe we'll get onto that later, I think. But could you talk us through some of your recent reporting, Liliane, around Ukraine's negotiation with its creditors, around the country's debt? Maybe before you bring us into the news, it'd be good to take a step back just to define for our listeners, what are we talking about exactly and why it matters?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there was basically a moratorium put on about $20 billion of Ukrainian government bonds. And about several months ago, holders decided that it was time to renegotiate this with Ukraine. It was also part of the IMF debt restructuring with Ukraine, that this was a requirement of its program. And so over the last several months, you've seen these news reports here and there of these negotiations not going super well, of Ukraine not being able to agree with its bondholders on terms of how to restructure this debt. It seems like they did come to an agreement. Technically, they have until I think in September, probably they will actually finalize a deal, but they did come to a preliminary agreement. The bondholders committee accepted about a loss of 37% of their holdings, foregoing about $8 billion. There's a few things that are key here. Like, first, Ukraine being able to negotiate this and have made concessions with its bondholders. It's a good sign that Ukraine engaged in these negotiations, that it is agreeing to pay back some of these. But also it will allow Ukraine to save some money over the next 3 years by a combination of lower coupons and maturity extensions. But it's also a good sign because the idea is that once the deal actually goes through, the restructuring will sort of pave the way for Ukraine's market reentry as soon as possible when the security situation stabilizes and the country starts reconstruction. And so that's why, and a lot of people see this as a positive sign that the war will not last for several more years and that Ukraine will actually return to the market and be a market participant. So it's more some positive signs that there's these negotiations they went through and that Ukraine might be able to re-enter the market.
In terms of changing anything on the ground in the next few weeks or months, does it do much for that? Or is it, as you say, more of a sort of signal for the future?
I think it's a signal for the future. The war is definitely going to go on into next year, certainly.
Let's get a little bit more granular then and look at business on the ground in Ukraine. You said, Liliane, earlier that one of the big issues at the moment is raising taxes. Can you just bring us right down to the sort of ground level on this? What are businesses saying? What's the government saying? And how do you think this is going to play out over the next few months?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I think it's a sign that the government is in need of money to finance the war, right? And we're talking about this a lot. And that's why the debt restructuring thing was concerning, because Ukraine, how can it service its debts when it spends 100% of its budget on the war? And so one of the ways that it's decided that for this year, it's going to make up this about 500 billion hryvnia or $12 billion hole in the budget is partly by a combination of internal borrowing and then also an increase in individual, corporate, and excise taxes, as I said. And they want to try to raise around $3 billion from the increase in taxes. And businesses and business associations have come out hard against this. You have every major business association saying that basically putting more pressure on taxpayers, on people in Ukraine that do pay their taxes, is unfair when there's a ton of illicit business activity going on that's going untaxed. And so you have the American Chamber of Commerce, you have Penny Pritzker, who's the U.S. trade representative to Ukraine, local business associations saying, excuse me, why don't you go after all of the illegal tobacco sales or the illegal electronic sales or the illegal fuel sales? The American Chamber of Commerce estimates that illicit sales contribute to $1 billion in losses to the state budget every year. And so to them, it's, wait a second, right? We're paying our taxes and you want to raise taxes on us, increase the burden on us, while all of these people are engaging in illicit activity and going scot-free without paying taxes. And their feeling also is that if you increase the burden on people, that actually pushes them into the shadow economy even more as well. And so you have people trading insults. You had Oleg Horokhovsky, who is the CEO of Monobank, which is one of Ukraine's most popular banks, saying that in a Facebook post that anyone who comes to you with a proposal to raise taxes in a country that's at war is a traitor. And when people asked him, how are countries supposed to raise funds during a war? And he said, those who steal and loot during war are shot. So you have some pretty emotional statements here coming out. And one particular interesting aspect of this has been the increase. They want to basically put a military levy of 15% on new car sales, which will be on top of the already 5% tax on new car sales. And Marchenko, the finance minister of Ukraine, in response to complaints over this tax, said the house is on fire, and instead of wanting to buy a fire extinguisher, you want to buy a new car, right? I don't really see how that's as important as what we need. So you have a lot of different opinions here about this. The business community really unhappy. The government saying that this is what it has to do, and that actually the cabinet of ministers said that this is the softest option that they have to raise the funds that it needs to fund the war.
And Liliane, where does this ongoing discussion go in the next few weeks? How do you see this turning out?
Yes, so this is the government proposing amendments to the 2024 budget, which will have to go through Parliament and will have to be signed into law by the president. It's hard to know. The government does things, passes them through Parliament that business doesn't like relatively regularly, I would say. So we'll see. There's other reforms that they can try to put in place. And Marchenko alluded to this in an interview saying, okay, if there's going to be an increase in activity in the shadow economy, then that's for law enforcement to handle. If they are going to increase taxes, they could also increase digitalization and reforms of customs reform, particularly to try and alleviate some of these issues with illegal, illicit activity and also raise revenue from actually properly taxing things. I'll give you a simple example. The illegal import, rather, of iPhones in Ukraine. You have a huge percentage of iPhones being sold in Ukraine that are not being taxed properly. And it's something like over $100 and some million a year are lost to the state budget because of iPhones that are being sold without being taxed. There are other things that the government can do if it's going to pass this law, but we'll see. This is like in the heat of the moment right now, so we'll see how it plays out. But I personally wouldn't be surprised if this does pass. Just as a reminder, the parliament is majority Sluha Narodu, Servant of the People Party, which is the president's party. So if the government is proposing something and they have majority in parliament, in theory, that would pass, but we'll see.
Thank you so much for talking us through all of that, Liliane. One more sort of broad thing to talk about, I think, slightly away from taxes, is some of the other pressures businesses in Ukraine are facing now, more than 2 years into the full-scale invasion. What are your thoughts on that? What kind of things should we be aware of that your average business person in Ukraine has to think about and do?
Yeah, the biggest one, this is something I hear almost every day from different people in business. The biggest issue is mobilization. The pressure that mobilization is putting on businesses is immense. And what I mean by that is it's not just that they're coming to workplaces and drafting people and mobilizing them, which they are. In some cases, big companies like big steel plants, the draft officers basically just stand outside the doors and draft men. So you have this problem. And then you have, because there's a fear of that, you have men who are actually quitting their jobs and refusing to take official work because they don't want to be on the books. They are working either for under the table, like they're being paid under the table, or they might even be pushed into the shadow economy, right? Because they don't want to work officially. Speaking of the shadow economy, that's another aspect of this. And that's causing labor shortages in Ukraine. So I was talking to a business I was in their research and development department, and it was this really telling moment where there was this desk that it looked like someone had just taken their lunch break. And there was all these, for me, very kind of confusing formulas all over the computer screen, doing research for this particular technology. And the guy who I was speaking to, who works at the business, said, yeah, this guy was mobilized like last week. And he's like, we don't know what to do because this guy was one of our major researchers. And when you look around some companies, sometimes you realize how many men work at them. And especially in the tech sector, there's a lot of men. And you just think, okay, what happens to a business if they start losing these people? And there's already a huge labor shortage in Ukraine. People have left Ukraine because of the full-scale invasion. There was already a ton of brain drain in Ukraine, right? So you have people who left before, who've left during. It's creating a difficulty in finding skilled people. It's creating more competition. Actually, wages are going up in Ukraine because companies are competing for a smaller pool of people, which puts more pressure on the businesses because they have to offer more. And so it's just, anytime you talk to any business, what's your biggest issue right now? And they'll just tell you mobilization.
And on mobilization, Liliane, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of good options for really anybody. Is that your view as well? Obviously, viewing this as a foreigner from London, it seems as if it's a bit of an impossible problem, really, because on the one hand, the military need more men. On the other hand, as you say, lots of businesses are reliant on their employees. Is there any fruitful way out of this that you see?
It's really difficult. And the businesses, they feel a bit guilty sometimes complaining about it because they understand that people need to fight in this war, but they also know that the economy can't collapse, and they also are business people. They don't want their own individual business to collapse. And what can be done? We're actually putting together an article on this right now that'll be published shortly, what businesses are doing to get around it. It's really tough. They have to change their production. They have to decide sometimes to close certain parts of production depending on what they do. They have to decide to do less. One interesting aspect of this is that there's this idea in the West, and I'm American, so it comes to my mind really easily too, that there will be this kind of Rosie the Riveter moment in Ukraine where women will replace all of the men in workplaces, and that will allow the economy to stay strong and resilient. And that's actually not really happening. If you talk to economists, if you talk to people in business, they'll tell you, sure, women have replaced men in some places, but you have to remember, a lot of the people who have left Ukraine during the war are women, especially mothers with children, younger women. They've gone abroad because they can go abroad, right? you have women who have left. The women who are here, they have jobs, they also have families. And so when you talk to companies and you ask them, are you replacing the men that are being mobilized with women? They say, look, if a woman walks through the door, we'll gladly hire her, but they don't really walk through the door that often. And what are they doing to alleviate it? They're doing what they can, but the options are extremely limited.
Liliane, thank you so much for your time. This has been very interesting, I think, for us and especially our listeners around the world. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for us to take away from today?
I think for me as the business editor, I'm always amazed at how resilient Ukrainian businesses are despite the situation. And I am in awe that it can continue to go on when things, if you look at the numbers and everything seems so terrible. But yeah, it's something really worth watching is how Ukrainian businesses are managing within this situation and how the economy is functioning and the different options the government is trying and how people react to that. I think it's like you guys were saying at the beginning, how we'll read about this in history books later and the lessons that we'll glean from all of this and how a country can keep functioning and the things it does well and the mistakes it makes to keep its economy going during a war will be very interesting.
Coming up, we hear Francis and Liliane's final thoughts. Liliane Bivings, thank you so much for your time. We'll come back to you for a brief final thought if you'd like, but first can I go to Francis Dearnley?
Thanks, David, and thanks, Liliane, for your time today. Always really interesting to hear your perspective. I want to end on a little bit more of a positive note today. I hope listeners are enjoying the Olympics. It is once every 4 years after all, and I know some listeners know me as Francophile Francis. It's not because of that I enjoy the Olympics. Indeed, I may have to retire that nickname soon, given Macron's inertia over Ukraine after so many strong proclamations. But as I say, that's a conversation for another time. I'm going to end on an optimistic note. The Ukrainian athletes are there in force, and last night Ukraine won its first medal, appropriately enough, in fencing, where Olga Karlan came back from behind to earn a place on the podium, winning the bronze. Her reaction has gone viral. She's there with her fencing mask and pointing at the flag on the front, saying, "Ukraine, this is for you, my dear. This is for you. This is a message to all the world that Ukraine will never give up. This medal is totally different. It's special because it's for my country. All the athletes here are going through the war. We are showing that we can fight, and I showed it somehow." And as we often say on the podcast, sometimes the metaphors write themselves, and the Olympics often provides that stage for many such stories and metaphors to emerge. I think we can expect to see many other Ukrainian athletes do very well and indeed see their support continuing to flourish. I've been spotting lots of Ukrainian flags in the audiences of the various different stadiums and arenas. Much to enjoy, hopefully, over the next week and a half in that. And then, of course, we have the Paralympics afterwards. So a sporty occasion to hopefully try and inject a little bit more optimism about the state of humanity at the present moment.
Thank you very much, Francis, for your time in reporting today. Liliane, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
Thank you. I'll try to end on an optimistic note as well about the Olympics. It's really exciting that Ukraine is doing well there and is represented there. But I think it's worth mentioning as well how many Ukrainian athletes will not be there, either because they're fighting on the front lines or they have been killed by Russia's war, or because sports centers in Ukraine have been destroyed. But still, to end on a positive note, it's still amazing to watch Ukrainian athletes do well at the Olympics. And I think one thing we've noticed as a media organization is how much people love athletic achievements of Ukrainians. And it's a way that people can support Ukraine in some way and feel excited for Ukraine and feel positive about Ukraine despite the current situation. So I think this week will be a fun one for us to get to watch our athletes perform well or even just be there and to see the support for Ukraine at the Olympics.
Thank you so much for your time, Liliane. It's been really good hearing from you again. It just goes for me to say that Ukraine the Latest is, of course, a podcast as well as a Twitter space. Please do find us on your podcast apps or platforms. If you would like, do leave a comment and a star rating. It does help us reach more people. And as always, our email address is in the show notes on all of those podcast apps. And do feel free to reach out to us. It's always very good to hear your thoughts, questions, observations. Thank you very much, Francis and Lilian. Thank you so much, all of you, for listening, and have a very good afternoon. Goodbye. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.